The void is silent, but it is never empty. Across the starlit reaches of the segmentum obscurus, countless Imperial colonies lie abandoned, their manufactorums rusting, their vox grills dead, and the echo of human life reduced to whispers among the corroded halls. Here, where the Adeptus Administratum once sent envoys and servitors, the shadows have grown long, and the whispers of the void are louder than the prayers of any lone Imperial citizen. To venture into these forsaken worlds is to confront the fragile nature of mankind's dominion, where every abandoned hive city, every silent forge, carries the weight of lost hope and untold peril. And yet, despite the desolation, life persists, not as it was, but in twisted, unpredictable forms that test the boundaries of survival, morality, and faith. Before we descend further into this darkness, remember that the universe itself demands attention. Like, share, and subscribe if you are ready to witness the stories of worlds humanity has forgotten, to see the Imperiums reach beyond its golden throne, and to question what remains when the Emperor's light fades from sight. The sky above the abandoned hive was a muted gray, a relentless pall that dulled even the memory of sunlight. I had not seen a living soul for days, not a single cleric, laborer, or scavenger. The streets were lined with the skeletal remains of Imperial architecture, spire after spire, their gilded aquilas chipped and blackened, balconies crumbling like brittle teeth. Dust swirled in every crevice, and the bitter tang of promethium lingered, the ghosts of furnaces long cold. I moved slowly, boots scraping the cracked pavement, aware that every step could betray my presence to unseen predators, whether human, xenos, or something far worse. In the silence, sound became a form of currency, the distant drip of water from a collapsed duct, the groan of an ancient servitor shuffling through a side passage, the echo of my own ragged breathing. They all seemed amplified, each noise a warning or a lure. I kept my hands close to my last pistol, though I knew that in this forsaken place, a single shot could summon more trouble than it solved. Once a whisper of movement among the shadows made my heart stutter, only to reveal a tangle of wire and metal, another servitor, its cogitator eye dim and unresponsive. Forever repeating tasks it no longer comprehended. Hunger and thirst had become secondary to the constant calculation of danger. Rations scrounged from ruined storerooms offered little comfort. The taste of hard, chemically preserved bread and water thick with sediment reminded me that survival here was a battle of endurance, patience, and instinct. The air itself was oppressive, thick with the weight of history and decay. Each inhalation carried particles of rust, ash, and centuries-old machinery oil. It was as if the hive itself exhaled its despair, and the longer I stayed, the more it felt alive in its mourning. A vast organism that had outlasted its masters only to rot in solemn grandeur. I passed a collapsed aqueduct, the remnants of water still trickling in thin, poisoned streams. Shadows clung to the arches like reluctant ghosts, and I sensed eyes where none should be. The hive's geometry was a labyrinth of corridors, tunnels, and vertical shafts that defied orientation. Maps were useless. Even data slates, partially functional, offered only fragmentary schematics corrupted by time. Survival required not only vigilance but memory, mental mapping of patterns, the ability to recall which streets led to dead ends, which alleys harbored hidden stairwells, which ruins could provide shelter without inviting intruders. Every misstep could be fatal. Above all, there was the silence, the oppressive absence of the living. I had walked entire blocks without a single voice, not a single shout, not a single mechanical hiss of properly functioning machinery. Even the vox grills lay dormant, their speakers blackened, their once imperative commands dissolved into static and dust. I imagined the administratum clerks, the tech priests who once walked these halls, now forgotten by the Imperium, their names erased from data slates and memory alike. And in that imagining, I felt the cold grip of reality. This hive was abandoned, a grave not of stone but of steel, concrete, and the lingering scent of human ambition. A sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow that flickered across the edge of a shattered window. My pulse accelerated. I raised the last pistol, sighting along the iron railing of a collapsed bridge. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted, a presence as palpable as the dust in the air. It was in moments like these that the hive revealed its true nature, a living entity that fed on fear, that tested the resolve of any who dared tread its forgotten streets. I whispered a prayer to the Emperor, a liturgy half remembered from days long past, and the words felt brittle on my tongue, a fragile defense against the void. Here, Survival demanded more than weapons or instinct. It demanded patience, a willingness to watch, to wait, to understand the rhythm of a place abandoned yet vigilant. The hive's silence was deceptive. Beneath the layers of dust, debris, and rust, life persisted in forms I could not yet see. Vermin twisted by the absence of order, plants that had clawed their way through concrete fissures, the occasional stray human, hiding and watching, wary of anything that moved. Every step forward was a negotiation, a delicate conversation with a world that had forgotten what it meant to be human, yet remembered everything else. The further I advanced, the more I understood that this hive was not empty in the way I had imagined. Its emptiness was active, a living, breathing reminder of absence. Every corridor, every collapsed stairwell, every silent manufactorum carried a history too heavy to ignore. And yet amid the despair there was a clarity. To survive here was to become part of the hive's rhythm, to move with it, to anticipate its hidden movements. The silence was no longer a void but a guide, shaping my actions, teaching me the language of desolation. The deeper I delved into the hive's lower levels, the heavier the air became. Stale, metallic, and almost tactile, it clung to my skin, settling in my lungs with every cautious breath. Rust and soot formed a layer over everything, as if time itself had left a residue to mark the abandonment. Pipes, long stripped of coolant or any function, sagged overhead like the spine of some colossal slumbering beast. Every footstep echoed with a hollow resonance, bouncing off walls in a cacophony that warned of my presence while threatening to betray it. I had to move with the patience of a Skitarii scout, careful and deliberate, attuned to the subtle signals of decay and life alike. Corrosion had taken everything. Stairwells had collapsed into yawning pits, metal girders twisted like the limbs of something unnatural, and the corridors were littered with the remains of machinery that had once hummed with the energy of human ambition. Servitors slumped in permanent slumber, their cogitators cracked and wires spilling like entrails. Occasionally, a flicker of movement would betray a partially active unit, its programming looping endlessly, unaware of the centuries that had passed since it had last received orders. Their silence was deafening, and their presence unnerving, for they were not alive, yet neither were they truly gone. I skirted their pathways, careful not to disturb them, knowing that any misstep could awaken unpredictable malfunctions. Hunger gnawed at me, a constant reminder of the precariousness of my situation. I scavenged what I could from abandoned storerooms, synthetic protein rations, water filtered through rusted channels, and occasional scraps of preserved meats. The taste was bitter, chemical, almost mocking in its inadequacy, yet it sustained me. Beyond the physical, though, it was fear that threatened to consume me. The knowledge that I was alone, unobserved by the Imperium, surrounded by the detritus of its failed reach, was a weight heavier than any pack or weapon. The silence pressed down, making every shadow suspect, every faint sound a potential threat. Then, from deep within the labyrinthine tunnels, I heard it. The faint hum of a power source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the vibration in the metal beneath my boots confirmed it. A manufactorum generator, partially functional, still thrumming with residual energy, feeding some long-abandoned process. I approached cautiously, every muscle taut, senses stretched to their limit. The air grew warmer, tinged with ozone and burnt oil. Machinery whirred, though in fits and starts, producing erratic sparks that illuminated the darkness in brief, violent flashes. For a moment, I imagined the ghost of a tech priest wandering the floor, murmuring forgotten prayers to the Omnissiah. I skirted around broken assembly lines, noticing the detritus of industry left in haste, crates of unprocessed materials, half-finished weaponry, and data slates flickering with corrupted files. Some displayed fragments of Imperial directives, incomplete orders, or mere fragments of text in the High Gothic script. It was a glimpse into the bureaucracy that had once maintained this hive, a bureaucracy now reduced to static and dust. And yet, despite the decay, I felt the weight of human achievement, of labor, and of faith embedded in these ruins. The hive had been alive, and even in death, it retained a memory of its purpose. I passed through a collapsed atrium, the floor giving way to a pit where the remnants of a transport system had tumbled centuries ago. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt circuits and mold. Tiny, twisted forms skittered along the edges, rats mutated by the decay, their eyes glinting in the dim light. Each movement reminded me that the hive, though abandoned, was not devoid of life. Survival here was not just a test of strength or firepower. It was a constant negotiation with the remnants of existence, both natural and synthetic. Every step was calculated, every breath measured against the risks of curiosity, hunger, and isolation. I came across a collapsed communications hub, the Vox grills cracked, the amplifiers dead. Yet faint traces of signal interference persisted, humming in the silence like a memory of sound. I placed my hand on a console, the surface warped and slick with rust, feeling the cold pulse of a world that had once spoken constantly in data streams and orders. The thought of the administratum, now hundreds of light years away, enforcing laws and taxation from sectors I would never see again, struck me with bitter irony. The Imperium's reach had abandoned this hive, leaving behind a skeleton of governance, faith, and industry that had become its own predator. And then, in the periphery of my vision, I glimpsed it, a shadow flitting between the remains of a stairwell, too deliberate to be random. My pulse quickened. I raised the last pistol, muscles coiled, breath shallow. The shadow paused, lingering as if observing me in return, and then vanished. I swallowed hard, the taste of metal in my mouth. The hive had eyes where none should be. It had patience and it had memory. My presence was a note in a symphony it had been playing long before I arrived. The silence, I realized, was not passive. It was sentient in its own way, testing, probing, judging. By the time I reached the lower industrial sectors, the air had grown almost unbreathable, thick with decades of promethium residue, mold, and the faint tang of decay. The corridors here were narrower, the ceilings lower, as if the hive itself pressed inward, compressing its history into claustrophobic passages. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by dust and the oppressive sense of being constantly watched. I realized that the hive did not merely harbor echoes of life. It had absorbed them, folding the memories of its inhabitants into its very structure. Shadows clung to the walls like wet cloth, curling around broken machinery, hiding in the hollow mouths of collapsed ventilation ducts. In one chamber, a servitor half buried beneath a pile of rusted components stirred at my approach. Its eye flickered weakly, registering my presence, though it had long forgotten why. Its hydraulic limbs creaked as it attempted to rise, but collapsed again under the weight of disuse. The sight was both terrifying and pitiful. A relic of the Imperium programmed for productivity, now reduced to a shivering husk. I skirted around it, careful not to provoke a malfunction. Even in its crippled state, the servitor could have become lethal. This hive had once thrummed with organized activity, and in its silence it still maintained the illusion of vigilance, testing intruders with subtle menace. I stumbled upon an old data slate, cracked but still faintly illuminated. Its screen displayed fragmentary reports, each line of text a ghostly remnant of the bureaucratic machinery that had sustained this colony. Orders to process raw minerals, to maintain production quotas, to repair failing systems, all now meaningless, yet frozen in the digital ether. I traced the words with a gloved finger, feeling the weight of history in the cold glass. The administrators, the tech priests, the laborers who had once animated this place with purpose, they were gone, and yet their labor, their intentions remained, etched into the bones of the hive. It was a record not just of what had been done, but of what had been lost. Movement caught my eye again, quick, deliberate, and unnervingly silent. I raised my last pistol, sweeping the corridor with a slow, practiced motion. Nothing. But the instinct remained, that subtle certainty that I was not alone. Something or someone had adapted to the hive's silence, had learned to navigate its ruins without drawing attention. Perhaps it was a survivor, a scavenger, or something stranger, mutated by isolation or chaos taint. Every instinct screamed caution, but curiosity, sharpened by necessity, drove me forward. I knew that here, hesitation could be as deadly as aggression. As I ascended a broken stairwell, the remnants of the upper hive revealed themselves in slivers of muted light. Sunlight, or what little filtered through the smog, struck the shattered spires, painting them in muted gold and gray. I paused, taking in the scale of abandonment. Entire districts had collapsed into ruin. Bridges hanging like broken bones, skyways twisted and half submerged in debris. The hive was vast, a city-sized monument to human ambition and neglect, and I was but a single figure moving cautiously through its arteries. I realized that survival depended, not on strength alone, but on understanding the rhythm of decay, the unspoken rules imposed by absence. Hunger and exhaustion tugged at the edges of my consciousness, yet a greater force kept me moving. The unspoken imperative to witness, to map, to endure. Every ruined manufactorum, every silent street, every collapsed atrium was a lesson, teaching me the patterns of a world abandoned yet alive in its own right. I began to sense the cadence of the hive, the flow of air through broken ducts, the subtle vibrations of shifting metal, the faint hum of failing generators. It was a language, one of absence and memory, and learning it was key to surviving the night. By the time I reached a collapsed residential sector, I had grown attuned to the hive's nuances. I could detect threats before I saw them, a shadow too long, a sound too precise, a flicker of movement in peripheral vision. The streets, though silent, spoke to me. They told stories of lives once lived, of faith and labor, of hope crushed under the weight of abandonment. Yet even amid despair, there was resilience. Tiny green shoots emerged from cracks in concrete. Scavengers moved silently in the shadows, and the hive itself endured, a testament to the stubborn persistence of life and memory. As night fell, the silence deepened. The darkness was complete now, thick and heavy, broken only by the erratic sparks of failing machinery and the faint glimmer of a data slate left flickering on a console. I found shelter in a collapsed atrium, the walls providing both cover and a sense of containment. I lit a small, controlled flame, careful to avoid attracting attention. The hive's silence pressed in from all sides, yet there was a strange comfort in its constancy. I was alone but not unobserved, and in the darkness I understood that this world, abandoned by the Imperium and forsaken by time, had its own rules, its own sentience, and its own tests. To survive, I would have to learn them all. The manufactorums of the abandoned colony sprawled like the skeletal remains of some industrial titan, their halls vast and echoing, filled with machinery that no longer hummed in the disciplined cadence of labor. Rust hung from every girder, and the tang of promethium smoke clung to the air like a ghostly perfume. Conveyor belts lay frozen, their belts frayed and tangled, carrying nothing but the detritus of centuries. I stepped cautiously across the cavernous floors, my boots clanging against metal plating that had warped under the relentless weight of time. Somewhere deep in the shadows, a servitor's eye flickered and died again, a weak pulse in a sea of decay. And I knew that life here, human or mechanical, was always a precarious negotiation with chance and entropy. The air was thick with the memory of labor, each room a mausoleum of industry. Cranes hung motionless above assembly lines, their hooks swaying faintly from the vibrations of distant collapse. I ran my gloved hand over a control panel, dust and corrosion thick upon it, feeling the residual hum of forgotten power circuits. Data slates blinked sporadically, their screens flickering in fragmented high Gothic script, recording orders long obsolete. A sequence of digits for raw material quotas scrolled endlessly, never fulfilled, while maintenance logs ended abruptly as though the scribes themselves had vanished mid-task. It was a language of absence, a dialogue with ghosts that demanded understanding if one hoped to survive. As I moved deeper, I noticed subtle signs of adaptation. Small fires, deliberately contained, marked areas where scavengers or survivors had sought warmth or light. Makeshift barricades of scrap metal and crates indicated territories claimed and defended, a testament to human resilience even amid collapse. I traced the remnants of these efforts carefully, aware that the hive's silence often concealed more than it revealed. Every shadow could harbor vermin, mutants, or worse, a cultist kneeling in worship of something unspeakable, eyes glinting in the dim light, prayers twisted into new liturgies of survival. The manufactorums themselves seemed to mock my intrusion, their vastness amplifying every noise I made, drawing attention like a siren song to predators both living and spectral. At the heart of the industrial sprawl, I found what remained of a production bay. Once this floor had roared with purpose, factories churning out weapons, servitors, and materials to fuel the Imperium's insatiable needs. Now conveyor belts were shattered, storage containers torn open, their contents pillaged or eroded by time. Rusted machinery leaned precariously, threatening collapse, and the stench of oil and decay was overpowering. I crouched beside a half-dismantled lathe, noticing the precision tools left behind, still sharp, still lethal, waiting for a hand willing to use them. This was a place where the past pressed against the present, reminding me that even in abandonment, the manufactorums retained the memory of their function. There were whispers in the corridors, carried not by wind but by the vibrations of the building itself. I paused listening. The metallic groan of settling girders, the faint hiss of air escaping from a ruptured pipe, even the distant scraping of something moving across metal floors. It was all amplified, interpreted by my mind as voices, as warnings, as ghosts trying to communicate from beyond the grave. Survival in this part of the hive demanded more than caution. It demanded understanding the rhythm of the manufactorum, the patterns of collapse and entropy, the signs that indicated whether a path was safe or a trap laid by neglect or something more deliberate. Among the ruins, I discovered an array of partially functional servitors, haphazardly active, wandering the factory floor in loops dictated by corrupted programming. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, and sometimes frighteningly purposeful, as if the ghost of the machine's original intent had persisted beyond the decay of flesh and steel. Some carried tools, attempting repairs they could no longer understand, their cogitators flickering weakly, repeating tasks they had not completed for centuries. The sound of metal on metal echoed like a whispered accusation. The hive had endured longer than its masters, and it remembered. I skirted around a collapsed gantry, the shadows lengthening as the weak industrial lighting flickered and died. Small, twisted creatures scuttled among the debris, mutated rodents, vermin enlarged and sharpened by isolation, their eyes reflecting the dim glow of failing lumens. The manufactorum was a crucible, where life persisted not through the order of imperial design, but through adaptation, cunning, and brutality. Every step I took was a negotiation with this ecosystem of rust, shadow, and memory, and I realized that the ghosts of the hive were not only the servitors, or the echoes of human labor, but the very processes and rhythms the colony had once maintained. I came upon a shattered workshop, its walls blackened with fire and corrosion. Tools hung frozen in place, as if mid-motion, and the remnants of partially completed arms and weapons lay scattered across the floor. I lifted a rusted laser gun, testing its balance. Though long unusable without repair, it symbolized the ingenuity that had once fueled this world. The manufactorum was alive in spirit, in challenge, and to navigate it successfully, one had to respect its memory, understand its patterns, and anticipate its dangers. Every corridor, every chamber, every flicker of failing machinery reminded me of what had been lost and what persisted. The manufactorums were a living record of abandonment and survival, a labyrinth where time itself had become a predator, where the past could kill as easily as the present. To proceed, I had to learn the language of decay, to hear the ghostly hum beneath the silence, and to move with the patience of one who understood that in this hive, memory was more dangerous than any weapon. I pressed further into the manufactorum, where shadows pooled in vast hollows between rusted girders and collapsed catwalks. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying the acrid tang of burnt oil, corrosion, and the faintly metallic bite of iron. The silence here was deceptive, masking the subtle creaks and groans of steel adjusting to centuries of neglect. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, each sound carrying farther than I expected, and I moved with deliberate caution, knowing that the hive's machinery, though mostly inert, still had a way of asserting itself, whether through sudden collapse or the unpredictable actions of partially active servitors. Amid the chaos, I discovered rooms where machinery still clung to life. Generators hummed faintly, their power weak but steady, keeping tiny conveyor belts turning in endless, meaningless loops. A servitor shuffled along one of these lines, hammering a piece of metal in a rhythm dictated not by need but by corrupted programming. Its movements were precise yet hollow, and I could feel the oppressive weight of centuries pressing down through the metal and dust. This was the hive's memory, encoded in gears, wires, and oil, a record of work that had no living witness but persisted stubbornly, demanding recognition. Occasionally, data slates blinked with fractured instructions, screens illuminating fragments of text in flickering light. Some displayed production quotas, others maintenance orders, and a few were filled with emergency directives that had never been executed. I studied them carefully, aware that even partial knowledge of these directives could offer insight into the hive's hidden corridors, its traps, and its usable resources. One console showed a series of schematics for a now-collapsed gantry, revealing a potential path through the upper levels if I could reach it. Every fragment of information became a thread I could follow, a lifeline in a place where instinct alone was insufficient for survival. The deeper I moved, the more I sensed that the hive had grown unpredictable, shaped not only by decay but by forces that had emerged in the absence of oversight. Mutated vermin scuttled along pipework, occasionally pausing to observe me with small, intelligent eyes. I caught glimpses of more substantial movement, shadows too purposeful to be coincidental, though I could not identify their source. Each encounter, no matter how fleeting, reminded me that the manufactorums were no longer merely industrial spaces. They were arenas of survival, arenas where I was simultaneously student, observer, and potential prey. In one of the larger assembly halls, I discovered remnants of a scavenger encampment. Crates had been rearranged into makeshift barricades, bedding fashioned from old servitor padding, and meager rations scattered across the floor. The signs were fresh, footprints in dust, small fires extinguished only hours prior, and the faint scent of human sweat mixed with the chemicals of the manufactorum. Whoever, or whatever, had occupied this space knew the hive's rhythms intimately. It was a warning, and perhaps an invitation. The hive rewarded those who understood its patterns and punished those who acted rashly. I left without disturbing the site, retracing my steps carefully, aware that predators, human or otherwise, often watched the shadows I could not see. Even as I advanced, the manufactorum itself seemed to react. Pulleys groaned under long-forgotten tension, doors creaked open when I approached, and occasionally a loose conduit would discharge a spark, startling me with the reminder that the hive's machinery was unpredictable, alive in its own way. I learned to read the tremors in the floors and walls, to anticipate sudden collapses and moments of instability. Each lesson carried weight. Each misjudgment could be fatal. Survival here required not only skill, but a deep understanding of the patterns embedded in the ruins themselves. A faint, distant hum led me toward a restricted area once used for high-priority fabrication. The room was partially collapsed, the ceiling giving way to a jumble of metal and debris, yet residual power coursed through intact conduits. I noticed a servitor, partially active, its cogitator eye flickering as it attempted repairs on a panel that was beyond restoration. It paused as I entered, scanning me with mechanical precision, then resumed its futile labor. There was no malice in its actions, only an adherence to obsolete purpose, and yet I felt the weight of its scrutiny. The hive recorded everything, and even in this solitary expanse, I could not move without leaving traces, invisible yet palpable to anyone or anything that might follow. The manufactorums were a paradox, places of incredible ingenuity, of human achievement yet reduced to traps and tests by time, neglect and mutation. Every corridor offered both opportunity and danger. Every fragment of machinery held knowledge and risk. As I explored, I felt the creeping realization that the colony's abandonment had not only preserved history but transformed it. The very architecture, the rhythm of partially active machines, and the traces of former inhabitants had conspired to create a sentient ecosystem of ruin, one that demanded constant vigilance, instinct, and respect. I paused in the shadow of a towering assembly crane, its arm bent at an impossible angle. Sparks from a damaged conduit illuminated the vast emptiness around me, revealing rows of rusted machinery, collapsed conveyor belts, and scattered tools. The silence was suffocating yet full of lessons. I understood then that to navigate the manufactorum safely, I could not rely solely on strength or caution. I had to read the environment, anticipate its movements, and respect the echoes of its past. Only then could I hope to survive in the ghostly heart of this abandoned hive. The deeper I ventured, the manufactorums revealed their hidden layers, corridors folding back upon themselves like the creases of a great rusted book. Light from the fractured ceilings barely touched the floors, and every step kicked up centuries of dust that hung in the air like spectral fog. I had grown attuned to the subtle vibrations beneath my boots, the tremor of a shifting girder, the faint hum of a dying generator, the irregular beat of a servitor attempting to perform a task long beyond its comprehension. Each sound was a map, a warning, a reminder that this place had its own logic, one that I would need to obey if I hoped to survive. I came upon an industrial chamber of staggering scale, its ceiling lost in shadow, girders stretching out like the ribs of some mechanical leviathan. Assembly lines, once the arteries of production, lay broken and twisted, carrying only the ghosts of promethium-fueled labor. Here, I realized, the manufactorum itself was both mentor and predator. The rusted gears, the sagging cables, the half-collapsed walkways, they were all lessons in patience, calculation, and humility. I moved with deliberate caution, tracing the remnants of conveyor belts, scanning the shadows for movement, noting the faint glimmers of scavenger fires hidden in debris piles. Every misstep would be noted by the hive, every mistake potentially lethal. Then I noticed it, a series of footprints alongside a collapsed crane, fresh enough to suggest a recent presence. They were human, though scrawny and cautious, as if the owner had learned quickly the lessons of the hive. The paths led deeper into the manufactorum, disappearing beneath a pile of debris and shadow. I hesitated, curiosity warred with instinct. Whoever, or whatever, had left these marks had survived the hive's tests, and perhaps they were watching now, judging my own competence. I pressed forward, last pistol raised, aware that in this place, caution was the only path between life and death. As I followed the faint traces, I began to see signs of adaptation, improvised ladders fashioned from scraps of girders, crude hooks and ropes spanning gaps in the floors, and small cages likely used to trap vermin for food. These were not the marks of mere scavengers, but of humans who had learned to read the hive as fluently as I now attempted. The manufactorum was no longer merely a factory. It was a living ecosystem, shaped by decay, memory, and the ingenuity of survivors. Every step through its ruins carried both risk and knowledge. Every observation a fragment of survival in a world that had rejected its masters. I passed under a rusted ventilation shaft and caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A servitor, half assembled, limped across a collapsed walkway, its eye flickering erratically as it completed some endless, meaningless task. It paused, registering my presence with mechanical indifference, then resumed its work. Its persistence was unsettling, a reminder that the ghosts of the manufactorum were not merely echoes of the past, but active participants in the hive's ongoing life. I skirted its path carefully, noting the peculiar rhythm of its motion, learning to anticipate not just natural decay, but the patterns of semi-conscious machinery. In one chamber, a data slate flickered weakly. I approached and saw fragmentary schematics, instructions for assembly that had never been completed. A blueprint for a servitor, half-finished, sat frozen on the screen, and I realized the enormity of what had once been produced here. Entire armies of machinery, created to serve the Imperium's demands, now lay dormant, some broken, some partially active, all witnesses to the failure and perseverance that defined this abandoned world. I memorized what I could, knowing that such knowledge might provide advantage, or at least understanding, in navigating the hive's vast and lethal interior. The manufactorums themselves seemed to breathe. Metal groaned under its own weight, floors trembled in subtle undulations, and the occasional spark from failing conduits lit the darkness like distant lightning. I understood, with a clarity born of necessity, that this place was not merely a ruin. It was a teacher, shaping those who dared traverse it, rewarding observation and caution, punishing arrogance and haste. Every corridor, every shadow, every flickering light became a part of my awareness, a lesson in survival that would carry me forward, deeper into the hive, and closer to the truths hidden in its silent heart. By the time I reached the upper levels of the manufactorum, I could feel the scale of abandonment pressing down with an almost physical weight. Collapsed gantries formed mazes, sparks arced intermittently across rusted conduits, and the air was saturated with the scent of corrosion and decay. The hive had endured long after its masters had departed, shaping itself into a crucible where knowledge, observation, and adaptation were the only keys to survival. I paused to rest, listening to the faint hums, creaks, and mechanical whispers, feeling the pulse of a world that existed entirely on its own terms. The ghosts of the manufactorums were patient, and their lessons eternal. The abandoned hive was no longer simply a place of rusted machinery and shattered industry. Its shadows had begun to stir with a life that was neither entirely human nor entirely machine. The corridors that once carried the orderly footfalls of laborers now resonated with the subtle, irregular noises of predators. Mutated vermin, their flesh twisted by centuries of isolation, scuttled along broken beams. Their claws clicked against metal in a rhythm that was almost deliberate, as though testing intruders for weakness. I moved slowly, feeling the air thicken with the presence of unseen eyes. The silence had shifted. It was no longer merely oppressive, it was predatory. In one collapsed atrium, I found the remnants of a small group of humans. Their skin was pale, mottled by disease and the harsh environment, and their eyes darted constantly, calculating every shadow. They had learned quickly the lessons I was only beginning to understand. The hive demanded vigilance, and any lapse could mean death. One of them whispered from behind a barricade, a warning about something larger moving in the lower sectors. Their words were clipped, cautious, the cadence of people who had survived through fear and cunning rather than strength. I nodded and moved on, aware that I, too, was now being judged not just by the hive, but by those who had adapted to it more completely. I descended further into the lower levels, where the architecture pressed inward, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay and promethium. The darkness was near total, broken only by the faint flicker of sparks from damaged machinery. It was here that the first truly unnatural presence made itself known. A figure, part human, part something else, emerged from the shadows. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, and I could feel instinctively that it was aware of my presence long before I saw it clearly. My hand went to my last pistol, but I hesitated, weighing my chances. In this hive, confrontation could be lethal, and discretion often outlasted aggression. The figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the faint echo of movement and the distinct musky odor of mutation. I realized then that the abandoned colony had become a crucible, not only for survival but for transformation. Isolation had reshaped those who remained, bending their bodies and minds in ways that defied expectation. Cults twisted by faith or desperation could emerge from any shadow, blending seamlessly with the ruins. Xeno-scavengers might have learned to exploit the hive's labyrinthine structure. Even the partially active servitors seemed to have developed rhythms that were no longer entirely predictable. Every step forward required constant recalibration of strategy and perception. I continued along a narrow corridor, where the walls had collapsed in jagged splinters, forcing me to crouch and navigate carefully. The faint glow of bioluminescent fungi painted the floor in sickly green hues, illuminating the shapes of abandoned crates, broken machinery, and the skeletal remains of scavengers who had failed. Somewhere in the distance, a faint scraping sound echoed, rhythmic and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I crouched behind a rusted girder, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, and then silence. I waited, muscles coiled, senses straining. In this hive, silence itself was a weapon, a warning that death might be watching from just beyond perception. Then came movement from above. Shadows flickered across the ceiling as the remnants of a collapsed catwalk shifted. A humanoid figure dropped lightly, landing behind a tangle of machinery with predatory grace. It carried a makeshift blade, fashioned from metal scrap, and its eyes glinted with intelligence, desperation, and something darker. I recognized instinctively that it was not wholly human anymore. The hive had reshaped it, a predator born of neglect, mutation, and survival. We regarded each other across the ruins, assessing, calculating. The air was taut with tension, each of us a participant in a silent negotiation where misjudgment meant death. I moved cautiously, retreating to a safer vantage, my senses sharpened by the presence of this predator. The hive itself seemed to respond, the faint groan of machinery punctuating the oppressive darkness. I realized then that survival was not a static state. It was an ongoing engagement, a continuous series of adjustments to the environment, the creatures that inhabited it, and the faint whispers of other humans or mutants who might be watching. Every shadow was a riddle, every sound a test. The abandoned colony was a crucible in which instinct, knowledge, and nerve were the only currencies that mattered. Deeper into the hive, I discovered the remnants of a small skirmish. Blood dried into the grooves of metal floors, makeshift barricades splintered, and the scattered remains of weapons hinted at a recent conflict. The presence of other survivors or scavengers became undeniable. The colony had become a stage for a silent war, where only the cunning, the observant, and the patient could endure. I pressed onward, knowing that the predators of this hive were not only physical but psychological. The fear of the unknown, the knowledge that death could emerge from any shadow, and the constant assessment of whether every step I took might be my last. The deeper I descended into the hive's lower levels, the more I sensed that I was no longer merely traversing empty ruins. The air seemed alive, charged with anticipation, as if the shadows themselves were waiting to test my resolve. Broken machinery groaned under its own weight, cables snapped and hissed with residual energy, and somewhere in the darkness a servitor stumbled, its half-functioning cogitator attempting repairs long beyond comprehension. The sound startled me, echoing through the corridors like a warning. I crouched low, careful to stay in the folds of darkness, aware that in this hive, perception was survival. Mutated fauna emerged in patterns I could not predict. Rodents enlarged by isolation and toxic exposure scuttled across fallen beams, pausing to assess me with red, intelligent eyes. In one chamber, a grotesque hybrid, part human, part vermin, darted from shadow to shadow, disappearing before I could raise my weapon. Each encounter, though fleeting, reminded me that the hive was a crucible. Isolation and neglect had transformed life here into something alien, yet disturbingly adaptive. Every movement I made had to be deliberate, measured against the hive's own logic. Misjudgment could mean death, not just from creatures, but from the environment itself. The collapsing floors, the snapping girders, the sudden discharge of damaged power conduits. Then came the cultists. I recognized them from the marks they left. crude glyphs etched into walls, remnants of candles burned down to nubs, and faint traces of incense that hung heavily in the stagnant air. They were human in body but twisted in purpose, worshippers of the forgotten, the dangerous, the heretical. Their presence was deliberate and predatory, a constant reminder that even in abandonment, faith could become a weapon, and desperation could breed violence. They moved silently through corridors, their eyes glinting in the flickering light of corrupted data slates and failing lumens. Encountering them meant more than combat. It meant surviving the psychological terror they carried into every room. I passed through an industrial atrium where the skeletons of old machinery jutted from the floor like the bones of leviathans. Here, the hive revealed its cruelest lessons. Traps laid not by intent but by decay, stairs that gave way under weight, conduits sparking unpredictably, and collapsed walkways that required precise calculation to cross. Even the air carried hazards, the residue of chemicals, dust from centuries of neglect, and the faint ozone tang from overloaded circuits. Every corridor was a gauntlet, every chamber a test of endurance, perception, and nerve. The predators were not always visible. Sometimes, they were the environment itself, orchestrated with a patience that mocked human folly. I learned quickly to use the shadows, to anticipate the paths of both living and mechanical threats. Mutated vermin moved predictably once their habits were observed. Cultists followed rituals that, while dangerous, were bound by repetition and superstition. Even partially active servitors, erratic as they were, revealed patterns in their loops. By studying these rhythms, I began to navigate the hive with a cautious confidence, always alert to the unexpected. Every step required calculation. Every breath was an acknowledgement of the fine line between life and death in this forsaken colony. A sudden noise, a scraping, deliberate and unnervingly close, froze me in place. From the corner of my eye, I glimpsed movement. A predator shaped by isolation, part human, part mutation. Its form twisted by the hive's cruel hand. It lingered in the shadows, assessing, calculating, and waiting. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my last pistol, knowing that the first shot could trigger a cascade of violence or provoke the hive itself into action. I stayed silent, crouched low, and measured the space between us, understanding that in this place, instinct alone was insufficient. Survival demanded attention, calculation, and an acceptance that death could come at any moment from any direction. The hive tested more than reflexes. It tested resolve. Fear was constant, gnawing at the edges of rational thought, forcing hesitation and caution. Hunger, exhaustion, and isolation compounded the pressure, shaping my mind into something sharper, more alert. Every corridor became a lesson in patience, every shadow a teacher. The predators, mutants, cultists, scavengers, and even the semi-conscious machinery were the instructors, and mistakes were punished swiftly and irrevocably. I pressed on, navigating through broken assembly halls and collapsed stairwells, guided by the faint hum of residual power and the subtle vibrations that marked the presence of unseen creatures. Each encounter, each narrow escape, each observation of the hive's predators and predicaments built a map in my mind, a mental blueprint of survival. Here, in the crucible of abandonment, the lessons of observation, adaptation, and patience became the only currency that mattered. Every choice was deliberate, every movement weighed against consequences, and the hive's silence, once oppressive, had become a rhythm to follow, a guide through its perilous corridors. I moved cautiously into a section of the hive where the corridors narrowed, forcing me to hug the walls as shadows pressed close from every side. The air was thick with the metallic tang of decay and the faint, acrid scent of promethium. Every sound I made seemed magnified, my boots scraping against broken metal plates, the soft hiss of air escaping from damaged conduits, the faint vibration of a collapsed stairwell shifting under its own weight. The hive was no longer just a backdrop. It was a predator, pressing in from all directions, testing my focus, my reflexes, and my resolve. Mutated creatures emerged from gaps in the debris with unsettling speed, rodents of unnatural size and sinew, their fur matted with grime and rot, darted across the floor. Some paused to assess me with intelligent red eyes, their movements almost deliberate, as if the hive had reshaped them to be cautious, adaptive hunters. I fired a single warning shot, careful to conserve energy and ammunition, and the creatures vanished as quickly as they appeared. Even this minor engagement left a residue of tension, a reminder that every corner might conceal a predator more lethal than I could anticipate. Cultists, too, had adapted to the hive's labyrinthine structure. Their footsteps were ghostly, silent against the wreckage-strewn floors. Occasionally, I glimpsed symbols etched in high Gothic, smeared with ash and blood, a language of fear and devotion intertwined. They moved not blindly, but with an intimate knowledge of the hive's rhythms. I realized that the abandoned colony had fostered their cunning, twisting faith into survival instinct. The shadows themselves seemed to bend around their movements, and each encounter demanded that I weigh engagement against retreat, choosing between action and patience with every heartbeat. I entered a collapsed manufacturing chamber where light barely pierced the ceiling. Here, the environment itself had become a weapon. Floors were fractured and uneven. Beams hung at precarious angles and sparking conduits threatened electrocution. I stepped carefully across the debris, memorizing the subtle patterns of instability, knowing that one misstep could trigger a cascade of destruction. The hive tested me relentlessly, blending environmental hazard with the presence of predators, and each success strengthened the mental map I relied upon for navigation. A sudden scuttling above drew my attention to a partially active servitor. Its cogitator flickered weakly, struggling to maintain its programmed duties. It moved with jerky precision, striking metal and tools as if attempting tasks it could no longer comprehend. I watched, recognizing that even malfunctioning machinery could be dangerous. The hive's hazards were multifaceted, and survival demanded awareness of both organic and inorganic threats. Every observation was crucial, every decision potentially life-saving. I pressed further into the hive, encountering a small group of mutated scavengers. They were human in form, but altered grotesquely by prolonged exposure to toxins and isolation. Their movements were fluid and unnatural, their eyes glinting with intelligence and instinctive caution. We regarded each other silently, measuring the balance of power, assessing the risks of engagement. In this place, conflict was often a silent negotiation, the threat of violence enough to alter behavior. I chose to maneuver around them, recognizing that discretion was often the greater weapon than aggression in a hive that punished recklessness. By the time I reached the edge of a partially collapsed industrial atrium, exhaustion pressed against my consciousness. Hunger gnawed, and every muscle ached from the constant tension required to navigate the hive's predatory architecture. Yet the lessons of the past hours were clear. Observation, patience, and adaptation were the only guarantees of survival. Mutants, cultists, scavengers, and machinery alike formed a network of threats and tests, each demanding respect. The hive's predators were both literal and figurative, teaching that life in abandonment required more than courage. It demanded vigilance, understanding, and the ability to act with precision when all else was uncertain. The hive had become a crucible, a relentless test where every shadow, every sound, every step carried consequence. It was a world where instinct met intelligence, where memory and observation dictated survival. As I rested briefly, listening to the subtle hum of failing machinery and the distant scuttling of creatures, I understood the immutable truth. The abandoned colony was alive in every sense that mattered, and those who wished to endure had to bend themselves to its rhythms, respect its predators, and navigate its predicaments with unwavering focus. Only then could one hope to survive its silent, ceaseless trials. The corridors grew wider, the ceilings higher, though the darkness thickened in response, and every step felt like crossing an invisible threshold. Air currents whispered through collapsed ventilation ducts, carrying faint scents of ozone and promethium. I stumbled upon a chamber that had once housed an observatory, now reduced to shards of glass, twisted sensor arrays, and scorched consoles. Data slates still flickered sporadically, displaying fragments of star charts, warp currents, and navigational coordinates. I traced the lines with my finger, the light from the screen illuminating the hollow planes of my face. For a moment, I imagined that the colony itself was listening, reflecting back fragments of its distant kinship with Terra. With the Emperor's guiding light, with the Astronomicon itself. It was here. Amid the shattered observatory, that rumor became tangible. Survivors' whispers, fragments of hymns etched in high Gothic, and data slate annotations all suggested that the Astronomicon's light had influenced this place, long after the Imperium had abandoned it. Some spoke of visions, fleeting glimpses of the Emperor's countenance, radiant yet inscrutable in reflections of shattered glass or the hum of failing machinery. Others described the faint glimmer of a distant lighthouse, a beacon perceived only in dreams or meditative trance. I could not verify these accounts, yet the sensation was undeniable, pressing against the mind like gravity, urging attention to phenomena both physical and metaphysical. I wandered through halls that had once been central to the colony's governance and observation. Archives of celestial charts, partially destroyed, displayed coordinates of systems I could not recognize, or perhaps had never truly existed beyond speculation. Servitors lay in ruined corridors, their cogitators flickering, some repeating fragments of liturgy to the Emperor or the Astronomicon, trapped in loops that had outlasted their creators. I felt as though the colony, in its silence, had absorbed and preserved the faith and rituals of generations, acting as an unintended shrine to the distant throne, a repository of both knowledge and devotion. Movement flickered in the shadows. I caught glimpses of figures, some human, some altered by mutation or desperation, moving in the periphery, always aware, always watching. They did not approach directly. They seemed attuned to the resonance I had felt, as though the hive itself guided their paths. Whether they perceived the echoes of the Astronomicon or simply respected the hive's rhythms, I could not tell. Yet the presence of life in these corridors, fragile and wary, reinforced a larger truth. The abandoned colony was not dead. It was a crucible of perception, of faith and of survival, a place where echoes of the Emperor's light and the distant Astronomicon intertwined with the relentless decay of time and neglect. In a ruined observation dome, the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi mixed with the weak illumination of failing data slates. I traced my eyes across the cracked instruments and broken lenses, noting the alignment of panels that once tracked warp currents. The thought came unbidden. Perhaps this hive had, for a brief period, served as an anchor, a minor reflection of the Astronomicon's guiding force in the sector. The notion seemed ludicrous, yet the sensation persisted, an intangible pull, as if the light of Terra reached here not in direct line, but through echoes refracted by faith, memory, and machinery. The chamber seemed to breathe with an eerie rhythm. Sparks from exposed conduits illuminated the broken instruments in staccato bursts, and in those moments, shadows played across the walls as though alive. The resonance of the Astronomicon, or the perception of it, pressed against the mind, a whisper of order in a universe that had long forgotten this outpost. I could not tell if it was real or imagined, a trick of exhaustion, hunger, and isolation, yet the effect was profound. The hive had become more than ruins. It was a place where perception, faith, and reality intersected, where every shadow, sound, and flicker of light could carry meaning beyond comprehension. I moved deeper into the observation sector, where corridors opened into vaulted chambers filled with shattered instruments and fractured lenses. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone, dust, and promethium residue, and each step felt weighted by centuries of accumulated neglect. Yet beneath the physical decay, there was a subtler current, an intangible resonance that seemed to hum in tandem with the faint, distant rhythm of the Astronomicon. It was not light nor heat nor sound in any conventional sense, but an almost imperceptible pressure against the mind, tugging at thoughts, coaxing attention toward the ruins' higher purpose. Here, the colony's survivors, or what remained of them, had learned to navigate both the physical and metaphysical dangers. Crude markings etched in high Gothic lined the walls, fragments of prayers to the Emperor, not merely as devotion but as practical talismans, guiding movement, avoiding traps, and signaling safe zones. I traced one with my gloved hand, feeling the residue of candle smoke and sweat. It was a ritual born of necessity and faith intertwined, a living testament to the ingenuity of those who had adapted to isolation and the hive's peculiar rhythms. Even in the absence of the Imperium, the hive had preserved the faith that once bound it to Terra. The Emperor and the Astronomicon, a servitor shuffled past, its cogitator flickering weakly, repeating fragmented liturgies in a mechanical cadence. The words were unintelligible in their entirety, yet the repetition carried weight, as if the act of recitation alone held power. I realized that the machinery and the human remnants here were not merely relics. They were participants in a larger pattern. Faith, memory, and machinery intertwined, creating a lattice of perception that extended beyond the immediate physical world. The colony had become a mirror of the Imperium's distant light, a distorted reflection of order pressed into the chaos of abandonment. In a ruined chamber that once housed celestial observation instruments, the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi illuminated shattered lenses and star charts torn and folded beyond recognition. Some instruments had survived partially intact. Dials and panels, though frozen, still hinted at their original precision. I crouched beside a console, brushing away dust and debris to reveal schematic fragments showing the alignment of distant warp currents and the sector's star systems. Even now, after centuries, the data whispered patterns. suggesting that the colony had once attempted to anchor itself to the Astronomican's light, however tenuously. Movement flickered at the edges of perception. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and I caught glimpses of figures, human, mutated, and something in between. Watching, observing, avoiding direct confrontation. They moved in rhythm with the ruins, almost as if guided by the same subtle resonance I had felt since entering this sector. The hive had taught them caution, but also attunement to forces beyond the material. Perhaps they perceived the echoes of the Astronomican. Perhaps they simply respected the patterns of decay and memory that governed survival here. Either way, the alignment of instinct, faith, and perception had become a living law within these corridors. I traced my path toward a central observation dome, its domed ceiling shattered, allowing slivers of muted starlight to pierce through layers of dust and fungal growth. The faint glow of data slates illuminated the floor, revealing crude barricades and evidence of recent habitation. I paused, listening to the mechanical hum of failing systems and the faint, almost imperceptible vibrations in the metal floors. It was as though the hive itself was alive, aware, reflecting back the traces of its past devotion, its attempts to maintain alignment with forces far beyond its reach. In these moments, the ruins became both teacher and mirror, revealing truths about resilience, adaptation, and faith. The resonance of the Astronomican, or its perception, seemed to pulse through the chamber, subtle yet undeniable. Sparks arced along broken conduits, briefly illuminating the surrounding architecture and casting dancing shadows across the walls. In that fleeting light, I imagined the Emperor's distant vigilance, filtered through centuries of neglect, mutation, and human ingenuity. The colony's echoes were not a direct connection but a testament to persistence. Faith and purpose could endure even when civilization itself had turned away. Each step forward became an engagement with both the physical and metaphysical hazards of the hive, a dance across thresholds that blurred reality and perception. The central observation dome was a cathedral of ruin, where broken instruments and shattered lenses stretched upward toward openings in the fractured ceiling. The air was thick with dust, ozone, and the faint remnants of promethium fumes. But beneath the decay there was a subtle, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to pulse through the chamber. It resonated not in sound alone, but in the mind itself, a pressure, a tug, as if the distant light of Terra's Astronomican had somehow bled into these ruins, refracted and fragmented, whispering truths that could not be articulated. I moved carefully among the debris, tracing fractured star charts and data slates that still flickered faintly, showing warped coordinates and incomplete readings. Each fragment suggested that the colony had once been more than a settlement. It had been an outpost, attempting to maintain connection with the Emperor's guiding light. Even in ruin, the instruments carried a rhythm, a pattern to be deciphered, a whisper of order against chaos. I noticed movement along the shadows. Figures emerged slowly, warily, some human, some twisted by mutation. Their forms adapted to the hive's rhythms. They observed me without confrontation, moving in ways that suggested attunement to something beyond the purely physical. Perhaps it was the echoes of the Astronomican, or perhaps the hive had taught them instinctive caution and perception, blending survival with faith. Their presence reminded me that the colony was not merely abandoned. It was alive with the adaptations of those who had endured its trials. Every corridor, every chamber, every faint hum carried layers of meaning, and to navigate it successfully, one had to perceive beyond immediate danger. I crouched beside a partially functional servitor, its cogitator eye flickering as it repeated fragmented prayers to the Emperor. The rhythm of its recitation, mechanical yet persistent, felt like a bridge between the distant light of Terra and the ruined, isolated colony. It was a reminder that even machinery, when imbued with human devotion and ritual, could become a vessel of persistence. In the stillness, the hum of the Astronomican, or the perception of it, pressed gently against the mind, guiding attention, shaping observation, demanding reverence without articulation. I realized that survival here required more than physical skill. It demanded alignment with the subtle currents of history, faith, and perception encoded into the colony's very structure. As I moved through the observation chambers, I noted patterns in the ruins, collapsed walkways aligned with data slates, scorched flooring marking past mishaps, and faint glyphs indicating safe paths or zones of temporary shelter. The colony's inhabitants, or what remained of them, had encoded knowledge and ritual into the environment itself, Each step became a negotiation with memory, faith, and the imperceptible pull of the Astronomican's light, refracted and reinterpreted through centuries of abandonment. Even in decay, the colony taught order through observation, caution, and respect. A sudden spark from a damaged conduit illuminated the domed ceiling, revealing shattered instruments aligned in patterns that mirrored star charts I had once studied on Terra. The effect was eerie. Light fractured across twisted metal, casting shadows that seemed to dance with purpose. In that fleeting illumination, the presence of the Emperor's guiding influence felt almost tangible, a whisper of structure amidst entropy, a reminder that even in abandonment, the colony had been touched by forces greater than itself. I understood that these echoes were not certainty, only perception shaped by memory, ritual, and devotion, yet their impact was profound, shaping decisions, movements, and understanding in ways I could not fully explain. I paused, listening to the low mechanical hum, the faint movement of survivors or mutated creatures in the periphery, and the subtle pressure of the metaphysical resonance pressing against thought. The abandoned colony had become a crucible, where survival, faith, and perception intertwined. Observation was life, and understanding the patterns, both physical and spiritual, was the only path forward. Shadows, machinery, and echoes of devotion coexisted, forming a lattice of meaning that extended far beyond immediate survival, hinting at truths the Imperium itself might not fully comprehend. The chamber, once a hub of celestial observation, had become a sanctuary of memory and resonance. Each spark, each flicker of light, each mechanical hum carried weight. The colony was alive, not with the bustle of labor, but with persistence, of memory, of faith, and of the faint, refracted echo of the Astronomican. It was a place where survival required more than instinct. It required attunement to forces both visible and invisible, a constant negotiation with shadows, history, and devotion. And as I moved toward the deeper corridors, I knew that these lessons were only the beginning of the truths this abandoned world could impart. The deeper I ventured beyond the observatory chambers, the colony's scale seemed to stretch impossibly, corridors folding into themselves and stairwells plunging into darkness that felt infinite. Silence pressed against me, but it was not empty. It carried whispers, faint and fragmented like prayers or warnings suspended in the air. Each step stirred centuries of dust, but it also stirred something less tangible, a presence shaped by isolation, faith, and the echoes of those long gone. The abandoned colony was no longer merely a collection of ruined manufactorums and observation domes. It had become a living testament to endurance, adaptation, and forgotten devotion. As I moved through a collapsed sector once dedicated to habitation, I discovered signs of human persistence etched into walls, floors, and ceilings. Graffiti-like marks indicated safe paths, warnings, and occasionally prayers to the Emperor or the distant Astronomican. Some were crude, others painstakingly precise, but all carried intention, a silent conversation across time between those who had survived and those who would follow. The colony had become a repository of human ingenuity, faith, and desperation, a place where survival and memory intertwined, each shadow and echo layered with centuries of trial. Mutants and scavengers, once purely predators, now seemed attuned to these invisible currents. Their movements were precise, almost ritualistic, suggesting that the colony's abandonment had not merely removed oversight, but had allowed evolution to take forms shaped by the architecture, machinery, and lingering faith embedded in the hive. I saw a creature pause, almost reverently, before a broken servitor repeating a fragmented liturgy, as though it recognized the persistence of devotion in a world that had forgotten the Imperium. Every encounter reinforced the notion that this place had its own logic, one that could be deciphered only through observation, patience, and respect. The deeper chambers revealed glimpses of the metaphysical. Faint luminescence from fungi or fractured conduits flickered across etched symbols, giving them a life of their own. Occasionally, a shadow shifted in ways that suggested intelligence, yet defied any biological logic. I recalled rumors from ancient records and scattered survivors' notes that abandoned colonies sometimes became conduits for warp resonance, their isolation amplifying the faint echoes of the Astronomican, or attracting presences whose nature could not be confirmed. Here, amid the silence and ruin, those rumors felt tangible, pressing at the edge of perception, demanding consideration even as their reality remained uncertain. I came upon a long, collapsed hallway, walls scorched and twisted by centuries of fire and neglect. It led to a massive chamber, once a central data archive, now strewn with fragments of records, consoles, and shattered servitors. The faint hum of residual power persisted, echoing faintly as if the colony remembered its purpose. Among the rubble, a fragment of a data slate displayed a warped celestial map, its coordinates aligned not with any known star system, but with something distant, unreachable, and perhaps imagined. It was a reminder that the colony had once reached beyond itself, attempting to touch forces vast and unknowable, and that even in abandonment, the traces of those attempts endured, shaping perception and belief. Movement stirred at the edge of my vision. Human figures or remnants thereof moved cautiously, observing, sometimes retreating. Their presence was faint but deliberate, as though the colony itself had cultivated survival into instinct and ritual. Some bore traces of mutation, others carried crude weapons fashioned from machinery and scrap, all adapted to the environment. Every encounter reinforced the pattern I had observed throughout the hive. The line between predator, survivor, and observer blurred, and survival required alignment not just with instinct but with the subtle logic encoded in the ruins themselves. The colony, in its entirety, revealed a broader truth. Abandonment did not equal death. Time, decay, mutation, and faith had coalesced to create an ecosystem where perception, ritual, and adaptation dictated the terms of existence. The echoes of the Astronomicon, the lingering devotion to the Emperor, and the instincts forged by isolation intertwined, forming a lattice of meaning that extended beyond mere survival. Every corridor, every shadow, every flicker of light carried lessons for those willing to observe, respect, and adapt. In such places, the line between the physical and metaphysical blurred, and understanding this interplay became the ultimate key to endurance. I pressed forward, navigating corridors that had collapsed in layers, forcing me to duck beneath twisted girders and leap across fractured floors. The air was thick with the residue of centuries, dust, scorched metal, and the lingering tang of promethium. Yet beneath it, there was a rhythm, subtle and persistent, an echo of the colony's past life. Every footfall carried through the halls like a pulse, interacting with the vibrations of residual machinery and the faint hum of warp resonance that seemed to linger from the distant Astronomicon. The colony itself had become a living map of history, faith, and survival, its every corridor inscribed with the lessons of abandonment. Mutated scavengers emerged from shadowed alcoves, their bodies twisted by isolation and chemical exposure, their eyes reflecting a mixture of intelligence and instinct. They watched, studied, and adapted, moving in patterns that mirrored the hive's own rhythms. I realized that their presence was not merely a threat, but a guide. Observing their behavior revealed the colony's hidden logic, the invisible threads of safety and danger that wove through every chamber. Each encounter sharpened awareness, forced calculation, and reinforced the notion that the hive's hazards were as much environmental and psychological as they were physical. Evidence of the colony's human inhabitants was scattered throughout. Makeshift shelters, crude markings, and fragments of prayers etched in high Gothic. These traces told stories of desperation, ingenuity, and devotion. Some markings indicated safe passage. Others were warnings or perhaps ritualized gestures to ward off unseen presences. The colony had become a palimpsest of survival strategies, a living archive of those who had endured, each layer of human activity echoing across the centuries. Observing these remnants was as vital as avoiding predators. They offered insight into both the physical and metaphysical challenges embedded in the hive. In a chamber that had once been a central data hub, I discovered the remains of partially functioning servitors. Their cogitators flickered, reciting fragmented prayers and calculations in loops, a mechanical liturgy that outlived its creators. The effect was uncanny. In the stillness, the persistence of faith and purpose became tangible. The hive had absorbed it, preserving not just physical structures but the rituals, the knowledge, and the devotion that had defined the colony's existence. I realized that these echoes of liturgy, machinery, and perception were the colony's truest form of life, more enduring than flesh or metal alone. Faint luminescence from fungi and sparks from exposed conduits cast shadows that danced across the walls, creating the impression of movement where none existed. Yet I could not dismiss the feeling that unseen observers were present. Survivors, mutants, or perhaps entities shaped by centuries of warp resonance. The line between reality and perception blurred. Each shadow, each flicker of light carried potential meaning, a warning, a guide, or an invitation to misstep. Survival demanded acute awareness, but also the capacity to interpret subtle signals, both physical and metaphysical, that the colony had encoded into its very fabric. I traced the perimeter of the central chamber, noting the interplay of architecture, debris, and the faint resonance that had first drawn me here. The colony's abandonment had not left it inert. It had become a living crucible where survival, faith, and perception intertwined. The faint echoes of the Astronomicon, refracted through centuries of isolation, intersected with human ingenuity, mutation, and ritual, creating an environment that was simultaneously threatening and instructive. Each step forward was a negotiation with forces both tangible and intangible, demanding precision, observation, and humility. As I prepared to move deeper into the hive, I understood the immutable truth. Abandonment was not annihilation. The colony had endured in its own way, preserving fragments of faith, knowledge, and instinct shaped by centuries of isolation and trial. Mutants, cultists, scavengers, and partially active machinery had become extensions of the hive's will. A network of predators and guides, hazards and teachers, and at the heart of it, the faint, persistent resonance of the Astronomicon served as both compass and enigma, a reminder that even in forsaken sectors, the Imperium's distant light could reach across space and time, touching those who dared to survive. The final corridors led me toward the colony's heart, a chamber where the ruins of governance, observation, and worship converged. The air was heavy with centuries of accumulated dust and the acrid tang of decayed machinery, yet beneath it, I sensed a pulse, a rhythm that was neither fully natural nor entirely mechanical. Sparks flickered from exposed conduits, illuminating the ruins in brief staccato bursts, and shadows danced along the fractured walls as if aware of my presence. Every flicker, every subtle hum felt purposeful, imbued with the memory of centuries of occupation and abandonment. Within this chamber, the colony revealed its ultimate paradox, a place abandoned by the Imperium yet preserved through adaptation, faith, and the relentless ingenuity of its inhabitants. Crude markings in High Gothic, fragments of prayers etched in walls and floors, and half-functional servitors reciting endless liturgies created a lattice of resilience that intertwined the physical and metaphysical. It became clear that the hive's survival was not merely a matter of brute endurance, but of perception, ritual, and adaptation, a lesson encoded into the very fabric of the ruins. From the shadows, I glimpsed figures that moved cautiously, observing without engagement. Some were human, their bodies twisted and gaunt, shaped by hunger and the rigors of isolation. Others bore mutations, subtle and grotesque, evidence of exposure to the hive's strange toxins and long-neglected machinery. Even these altered forms seemed guided by an understanding of the colony's rhythms, attuned to the invisible currents that shaped both movement and survival. The predators of the hive had become instructors, and every encounter was a test of attention, patience, and adaptability. I found a partially functioning data slate among the rubble. Its flickering display offered fragmented star charts and warp current mappings, coordinates that aligned imperfectly with the known galaxy. For a fleeting moment, it was as if the colony itself reached out, bridging centuries of neglect to whisper knowledge into the present. The faint resonance of the Astronomicon seemed to amplify here, refracted through the ruins, guiding perception without clear articulation. It was a reminder that even in abandonment, distant forces could shape local reality, that faith and observation could persist even when civilization had turned away. The chamber's oppressive silence was punctuated by occasional mechanical hums, the shuffle of scavengers, and the faint stirring of mutated forms. Each sound, each flicker of movement, became a piece of the colony's logic, a fragment of the pattern I needed to follow to endure. I understood that abandonment had not eliminated purpose or meaning. It had merely transformed them. Faith, survival instinct, and the echoes of distant light had merged, producing a complex ecosystem where the unseen and the uncertain dictated life. I paused, taking in the breadth of the chamber, the layered ruins, and the persistent hum of both machinery and perception. The abandoned colony had become a testament to endurance, ingenuity, and belief. It was a place where shadows taught lessons, where echoes of the Astronomicon shaped thought, and where survival required constant vigilance, precise calculation, and respect for the subtle forces embedded in its architecture. The line between predator, guide, and observer had blurred, and every movement demanded attunement to the colony's rhythms. As I prepared to leave the chamber, I understood the ultimate truth of abandoned Imperial colonies. They were neither dead nor forgotten. Mutants, cultists, scavengers, and partially active machinery formed an ecosystem forged by isolation and necessity. Faith, ritual, and the faint echoes of the Astronomicon infused the ruins with purpose beyond the material. To survive, one must observe, adapt, and respect both the visible and the invisible, understanding that abandonment had not erased life, but had transformed it into something far more intricate, subtle, and enduring.